Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. Time to start with an author profile. Always nice to get to know who we're going to be reading and what else we might be interested in once we finish this particular book. And today's author, Riordan, is certainly somebody that has a plethora of books that you can read once we finish the one currently on our list, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, The Lightning Thief, the first child's fiction that he wrote. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about Rick. You see, Rick's full name is actually Richard Russell Riordan Jr., but a lot of the fans call him Uncle Rick. Everyone kind of likes him, even if sometimes he does awful things to our favorite characters and then makes our hearts hurt. Yeah. But that's most authors, isn't it? Without things going wrong, books wouldn't be so fun to read. Uncle Rick was actually born in San Antonio, Texas, June 5th, 1964. He originally went to college to study music, but he ended up switching universities to study English and history, and ended up getting his teaching certificate in those genres. I think a lot of us are glad for the switch. Rick would go on to get married, and interesting fact, he and his wife actually share the same birthday, which is also their wedding anniversary. Less dates to remember, I guess. You just gotta make that one day a real big party. And they would go on to have 2 sons. Now, his sons did actually change his writing career in a lot of ways. You see, Rick was a writer prior to this point, but his focus has been on adult-based mysteries, the Tres Navarres series, for the most part. It was only when he had his sons that he actually started inventing the Percy Jackson series, the first of his many children's literature series. Altogether, we can actually thank his sons for a lot more. You see, Percy Jackson started out as a bedtime story for them, but when one son was diagnosed with ADHD and dyslexia, they became a standard feature for Percy, and in fact for a lot of the demigods that we see throughout his series. How does Rick Riordan explain this? Well, these demigods are actually rooted in different languages, ancient languages for the most part, which makes reading in English very difficult. And as for the ADHD part, demigods are naturally wired to deal with a lot of terrible things happening. So they're always ready to go and move, but also can get hyper-focused on things. So suddenly we get a lot of representation for some groups that aren't always represented in novels, at least not directly. Rick Riordan directly states that these characters actually have ADHD and dyslexia. He highlights some of the problems that they suffer as well, along with some possible solutions. And from there, well, it's kind of surprising. You see, Rick Riordan works with Disney Hyperion, and the Disney brand hasn't always been the most representative of companies. Yet somehow Rick Riordan actually brings a lot of representation in a lot of different areas. Learning disabilities for one, mental health issues for another, but we also have race brought in. Characters from Asia, Aboriginal groups, practically any section. And again, the problems are stated outright. The Kane series actually has an African-American boy at the center, and his father fully addresses the fact that people are going to judge him based on the color of his skin. So that means he's going to have to act and dress a certain way to try and deal with that fact. While the boy's sister is actually following after their mother in skin tone, so is white. So her hanging around with his father and himself, people find very strange. Rick Riordan has characters of different genders, non-binary genders. He has them of different sexual orientations. Mind you, the Greek gods sort of make that easy, but it's surprisingly uncomfortable to realize how much of that non-heterosexual nature to the Greek gods has been scrubbed out of myths that we tell people today. Apollo is notably bisexual. He has relationships with both men and women. But you don't tend to hear about those homosexual relationships, or the fact that Apollo likes both genders. Rick Riordan doesn't shy away from it. He has characters who are gay, characters who are hetero, characters that swing both ways. It's fascinating to see that somebody working with Disney can actually get this amount of representation in. And yes, Rick Riordan does have his critics for this issue. A lot of people noting that they're children's books. You shouldn't be showing kids this. Rick Riordan's response is that kids are well aware of their own feelings. They can be aware that they are not the gender that they're representing, and that they like somebody of the same gender, different gender, or both. To assume that kids don't understand these things already is to discredit them. So going ahead and showing them in books that they're reading that it's natural, there are other people like them, means that those kids are going to be more comfortable with who they are rather than less comfortable. That's why representation really matters on all of these scales. Rick Riordan is actually really powerful in this. It might help with the fact that he sort of tricked his way in. If you focus just on the Lightning Thief, you're not going to see all this representation. We do seem to start with white characters who are straight. Keeping in mind they're 12, so we're not really getting into that quite yet. We're going to have some crushes before we get into serious things in the later series, but he hasn't just stuck with that white hetero group. He has expanded. And again, even from the beginning, those learning disabilities come in. Rick, I want to say thank you. I'm from a very privileged position. It's nice to see this representation. And, in fact, Rick has actually continued this project, which we'll speak a little bit more at a later point in this video. First and foremost, though, I would like to go over the children's series that Rick actually has out, just to see how expansive this actually is. Like I said, this is focusing on the young adult, children's middle grade stuff. There is some adult ones, and he has co-authored other things. I'm focused just on what Rick has written. So, he started out with Percy Jackson and the Olympians, starting with The Lightning Thief, which was published originally in 2005. This was sort of his breakout hit, and he has actually received 2 awards that I am aware of for this. The Mark Twain Award in 2008, and the Rebecca Colladill Award in 2009. 2009 is actually when he finished the Percy Jackson series, of which there are 5 books. If I was trying to get all of them up here, I would have a lot of books, so I'm just going to be showing off the first of each of these series. Following Percy Jackson, he actually created a sequel series of sorts, The Heroes of Olympus, starting in 2010, so a year after he finished Percy Jackson. This one, though, brings in the Roman side of the Greek gods as well, Percy Jackson focusing just on the Greek. And suddenly we have a bunch more characters, and, like I said, a bunch more representation. A lot of side characters that we got in Percy Jackson actually grow up into their own, and we spread out a little bit. All of these kids have their own stories to tell, and we bring more in and talk about the split nature of the Greek gods as they showed up into the Roman gods. At the same time that he was writing the Heroes Olympus series, starting in 2010, he also was writing the Kane Chronicles. This one is a trilogy which he wrote between 2010 and 2012. This time, though, the focus is on the Egyptian gods. I am just starting into the Kane Chronicles, but so far, I am loving it. finishing up the Kane Chronicles and the Heroes of Olympus, Rick then focused on some Norse mythology with the Magnus Chase and the Gods of Asgard trilogy. Again, 3 books, which have just actually finished coming out in 2017, started in 2015. This one focuses on, like I said, Norse mythology. But we get a sense that these worlds are actually interconnected. One of the characters we meet from the very beginning of Percy Jackson shows up at points in the Magnus Chase series. So we do get the sense that all of these worlds are actually connected, and all these characters have their own stories that ultimately touch on each other, but they still have their own lives and their own problems. Magnus Chase is actually homeless at the beginning of the novel. Another representation that we don't often see, and it does humanize that side of people that we tend to dehumanize to try and just ignore the problem. And many people will know when this video comes out that we're actually working through another series. It is ongoing, having started in 2016, that is the Trials of Apollo. Here Rick Riordan has returned to the Greek side of things, though we can't get rid of the Roman side. That's always going to play a part in it since the Heroes of Olympus. But this one is focusing on Apollo, who, after angering Zeus due to decisions he made in the Heroes of Olympus series, which were actually the right ones, but Zeus is power tripping. Poor Apollo gets turned into a human boy and now has to go on a human adventure attached to a particular demigod. This one, to add all the representation in, does start dealing with abusive parent figures as well. Like I said, Rick Riordan is not afraid to deal with the fact that people are deeply flawed and children are often the ones who suffer the most for it. But the series always represents some sort of hope towards the end, even if things go really wrong in the middle. We read these stories so that we know things are going to work out, even if it doesn't seem like it for us at the time. I mentioned that Rick Riordan is continuing this project of representation, but he is not doing it just himself. His most recent project is actually Rick Riordan Presents, an imprint of Disney Hyperion, which helps bring other authors into the forefront. That is, own voice authors telling the mythology of their own countries, their own lineage, their own families. This is really cool, because this is Rick taking a step back to say he's not the only one who can write on these mythologies, and in fact some people might even be able to do it better than him. So far, there are 2 published books in the Rick Riordan Presents series, and a 3rd one has been announced to come out in 2019. They are on my list for sure, because Rick, again, is a little more hands-off. He's helping figure out who to bring forward, but he's not writing it all himself. Yes, I am excited, especially to dig in a little more deeply. The really important thing to note is that if you just treat something as children's literature and tend to laugh it off, especially if it is popular, then you don't always realize that it can teach you a lot and mean a lot to people. The representation that I've mentioned, which is just the tip of the iceberg, shows that there's more to these books already that we really should be paying attention to. So, Rick Riordan, please keep writing. You're everybody's favorite Uncle Rick. Keep representing people who don't always get to see themselves in books, and keep giving us really good stories that show we can beat the worst of humanity with the best of humanity. I'm going to start reading, and I hope you do too. Next up, we're going to head into the first chapters of Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief. Let's do this.